Another webinar. Today we're joined by Leigh. Now, Leigh, I must be honest, as the music was playing, I thought, oh, what's her name? What's her name? It's not Jill. I know it's not Jill. Do you have a Jill in your past life or something?
Maybe in a previous life, who knows? We could have that.
But you are definitely Leigh. You were with us last week.
That's right. Yeah.
Yes, and you were talking assessment then.
That's right, yes. So now we are moving on.
Yes, to planning.
Yes, which is also an exciting topic.
Is it?
Well, I'm sure teachers don't agree with me, but I think it is.
I know when I was
essential.
teaching, it was one of my personal favorite things to do was to sit down and plan. It made me feel organized. Whether I actually followed the plan or not, completely different story.
That's right.
But that whole feeling in control of my surroundings and what's happening.
You know, it can help strengthen your discipline. There's so many things it can do by being planned and ready. It just makes you, as you say, feel better and so more able to handle whatever might come your way.
I didn't even think of it from a discipline point of view.
Definitely.
Of course, because it takes that pressure off. I know at the end of this lesson I'm going to have completed this, and then I can just focus on the lesson as a whole.
Correct. And if you have a little bit more plan than thing, and even if you don't get to it, it's that feeling of, okay, if the class moves quickly, I can still keep them busy and engaged, and it's not that fearful feeling of, oh gosh, what do I do with these 40 little darlings or 50 little darlings?
Yes.
So it's quite good.
Yes. Okay, and of course we are joined by Dylan behind the buttons.
Dylan, who asks us good questions, so we're looking forward to that.
Yes.
And keeps us on the straight and narrow.
Yes, because we can stray, can't we?
Quite right.
Now, in the last few weeks, we've been talking about the book, Teach Like a Champion. And in the last few weeks, it's also been focusing on planning. So I'm going to do a little bit of a recap of the last few weeks, the different actionable steps.
That's great.
Okay, so it started off with the step begin at the end. And it said that you should always keep your end goal in mind, meaning the end of the section goal. And of course, with us in South African context, we have the CAPS document to assist with that.
Very useful document.
Yes. But then after that, it said, well, now that you know for the next 2 weeks you're going to teach factorization, now you need to divide it up into lessons. I forget what that step was called. But it moved then on to the 4 M's. And I know we spoke briefly about the 4 M's last week. And Dylan, I'm going to ask you to call them up again. It's 2 slides on.
Okay.
There we go. The 4 M's are manageable, measurable, made first, and most important. And what it said was that the content or the skill covered in that lesson should be a manageable chunk. You shouldn't plan too much because that means that you're going to have to compensate somewhere else. And you should be able to measure at the end of the lesson that you have covered that content chunk or skills chunk or something. So you can't just say, today we're going to teach taking out a common factor. You must actually measure the fact that you have. And we spoke about that, didn't we?
We did. We spoke about all the different ways you could do that.
Yes. Yeah. And then the made first, we're also going to speak about today, where it talks about choosing a suitable activity for your manageable outcome. Let's use the word outcome because that's what it is.
It is.
Yes.
Don't know why they got rid of all that jargon, but it is quite useful to call it an outcome.
Yes. So don't define the lesson around the activity. Find the activity that matches the manageable outcome, which, as maths teachers, we like working within our textbook. If it's within this textbook, it's gold, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes. We all know the names. Yeah. And then most important, meaning you keep the most important thing. So if you're teaching the difference of 2 squares, don't stray off into the sum and difference of 2 cubes. Stay on topic and constantly reflect within the lesson and after the lesson. Have I kept the most important thing? I
agree with you. I think that is very important because if you stray off too much, I know sometimes a child will ask you a question. What I normally do then is I just say to them, right, that is something we're going to handle soon. It's called this, but we'll get to it at a later stage. Let's stay with what we're doing now because they will have gone ahead or looked in a book or looked in a past paper.
I want to sound intelligent
and it's
in
so
front
tempting,
of everyone.
So tempting to go that route.
It is, isn't it? Especially when it's really interesting conversation, like the
You're
conversation
so
about
surprised this
dividing
child's
by
come
zero.
out with this that you're delighted.
Yes. No, exactly. But that's not what we're paid for, is it?
No,
We're paid for the
not.
difference of two squares. We stick to the difference of two squares.
And it will come up, whatever. Sometimes it's nice to actually tell them that it is going on. And I find this is very much a gender issue. Some children, I know the boys are not that worried about where you're going generally. I mean, I'm speaking generally. Girls are very worried about where you're going. They like to know the end points of everything. And that's just because I've taught in a boys-only school and a girls-only school, and it became glaringly obvious that they had different needs.
That's
you don't notice it when you're in a co-ed class.
Yes, Dylan.
Can I jump in quickly?
Yes.
I wanted to ask Leigh if it's just from experience, getting to know the difference between the kid who asks that question because they are genuinely interested and the kid who asks that question because they are
hoping you'll waste the rest of the lesson. Trying to show you up, trying to be smart and clever. Is there a way to bring that lesson back on track, back onto plan? Yes, there is. And you start to learn very quickly which child is misleading you deliberately, who will mention the latest rugby match or soccer game or something to distract you. And of course will use the opportunity of planning or going in a bit of a tangent if they can. And the easiest way is to sort of say to them, that is really an interesting point, but perhaps we can talk about this at break, and you'll be amazed how that demotivates any further discussion, because they're not that keen to do that if you suspect that they're not really interested. But if they are really interested, it's nice to say to them, that's something we'll get to in a few weeks' time. We'll handle this section or something like that. So I think it, you get to know your children from experience, and you only get caught once.
Yes.
Well, sometimes twice,
yeah.
But hopefully not more than that. And then you realize, I know I've had a boy when I was teaching at one of the boys' schools who every Friday would give me this terrible question from hell. I'm sure he used to spend the whole week looking for it. And then it used to be relevant to the topic we were doing, so it was something we'd discuss it in class. One day he came in and he didn't give me the question, so I asked him, where's my question for today? And he just laughed because he didn't realize I'd worked out that he was doing this every Friday. But it was appropriate, so I let it go because we were learning through the question, so it was fine.
Okay, then last week we moved on to Post-it, where we said we'd take the manageable outcome and put it on a piece of cardboard or write it up on the board, where the learners would then walk in, sit down, see it, and realize they've got something to work towards. Now, in last week's science lesson, or science webinar, when we spoke about Post-it, our guest Philip suggested that maybe sometimes you don't want to put the objective up on the board. Maybe you want them to discover it themselves.
That is also true.
I thought it was very interesting.
That is a valid point. It depends on what you're doing, yes.
Yeah. That's exactly. Maybe you want them to answer a question rather than put up, learn the definition of blah, 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 say, what is blah, blah, blah.
That's not a bad idea, to pose a question that you're going to answer for the lesson.
And it's all about phrasing, isn't it?
It is. And you can, look, there's nothing wrong with putting an objective up. I've even found on occasion a good idea, especially if a class is not very motivated and structured, to give them a copy of my scheme of work and say, this is our plan for this term. So if you are messing around, we're not going to finish up with all the work we have to get done. And that's amazingly focuses them a lot more because they realize, oh my gosh, there's quite a lot of work we've got to do here. Best not take too long on these sections.
Brings us back to planning.
It does.
And the importance of having everything in place before you begin.
I think that is something that I've noticed not all teachers do. I've always liked to have a whole year plan ready. And yes, you have to tweak it over the year. But I've known teachers who on a weekly basis decide what they're going to do, and it's very dangerous that.
You see my...
I can see
the control part in me is going, oh, no, please.
It is very dangerous to do that because you're so easy to get sidetracked when you have that plan.
Yes.
So, yes.
Yes, and also you come across a piece of content that's taking them too long to learn. My mother was educated in the American system. And, of course, they write SATs at the end of their matric equivalent, or not even at the end. So she says she spent the whole of grade 12 physics, no, it must have been chemistry, the whole of grade 12 chemistry examining the structure of an atom because her classmates pretended they didn't understand it. So they did the equivalent of a grade 10, what grade 10
And
chemistry
then she had to write
student.
SATs.
Yes. Well, she became a doctor, so she's done
Good thing.
okay. But there's the danger, isn't it?
No, that's
Not
very
good
big danger.
planning. You spend too much time on basic concept. You're manipulated by your class.
And they're very good at that.
Well,
I know, especially with saying we don't understand, and then the teacher in you sort of just wants to make it better for them.
Yes.
I think you've got to get to a point where you say, okay, I understand you don't understand, but maybe we need to do this after school or at break or before school and take it away, because it's not fair on all the other children that are actually following what's going on.
Yes.
And sometimes it's genuine that they really do not understand. Sometimes it is because they're taking advantage.
But if it is genuine, then it's even better to take it after school and in break and all sorts of
That
things.
one-on-one attention often gets through where they don't in the classroom situation.
Mm.
So, yeah.
Okay, well, this brings us to this week's actionable step, which is, I forget it. Sorry, Dylan, can you go back to the second slide? Back once more, the shortest path. And I wasn't sure if I agreed with this. Basically, the quote, and I've lost my quotation marks, it should say, all other things being equal, the simplest explanation or strategy is the best. And that's from Occam's razor. Okay, so basically they said, if you've got a range of teaching strategies or worksheets or whatever, and they're all equal in terms of their effectiveness, you should always opt for the shortest explanation.
I suppose that's working on the basis that it's always better to talk less and let them do more.
Okay.
I suppose that's what they're implying by that. And yes, I do agree that that is true. But also children see things in different ways. So your shortest might not be their shortest. So you'll explain using what you think is the shortest, but in actual fact they can't.
You see, everything in this statement is rubbing me up the wrong way. Because it implies that an explanation can replace an investigation.
No, I agree with you there. That's not the spirit. But I think that's what they're suggesting, is that talk less, do more. I think that's what they're implying. But I would agree that there's a time when you should be doing the talking and time when, but after they've had a chance to try or to work with the work, to grapple with it. Because I think that is something we as teachers also get wrong. We sometimes tell them too quickly because we feel time pressure to get through work.
Yes.
And as a result, they don't ever make it their own knowledge. Whereas if they grappled with it and they worked with it, all chances being they would then understand it and be able to go quicker when you move on.
Yes.
So that's a very delicate balance which comes from years of experience. There are some advantages to being in the classroom for very, very long.
Yes. Now, I think what rubs me up the wrong way about the statement is that it's trying to apply a blanket statement to all concepts and content across the whole of the schooling system. And yes, you can't.
No, you can't.
Euclidean geometry, they have to grapple with it in order to understand it. They have to explore how to construct using the compass and things like that.
I know, and lots of teachers actually bypass that stage. They think, oh, this construction stuff is not so important. Let me go straight to the actual Euclidean. But in the construction, they get to understand how the picture fits together.
Yes.
And that's what's important for me, anyhow.
So to me, it's almost implying that if you skip out that and you just give them the knowledge that they need to tackle the Euclidean geometry question, they're going to be fine. And studies have shown that spending the time on grappling with it is far more important, actually.
Well, I actually saw an interesting quote just before I came through to the studio today. It came from a person who's in the Madison, Wisconsin University, and he's written a book on maths. I can't remember the title, but I'll let you know and you can maybe post it. And basically what he says there is that if the only experience we have of mathematics is what we learnt in school, it is a very limited view of mathematics, because a lot of the school maths is designed to be done using a technique or an approach or whatever.
Paint by numbers.
Yes.
Yes.
And I thought, when I read it, I thought, gee, he has got a point there. It's important we don't just give them that impression of the subject.
Yeah.
Which unfortunately we do when we're under pressure.
And when aren't we under pressure?
Most times we are. And I think that's what's nice about your junior grades, your grade 8s and 9s. Because although you have got content, it's not as heavy as when you get to 10, 11 and 12. And that is your opportunity to start getting them to think and to get those things in place so when they get to 10, 11 and 12, they've already got this mindset, excuse the pun, of investigating and playing with something. I mean, how many times I will take a question and someone will say to me, how do you do this? And I said, give me a few minutes and I'll play with it till I find a way. A lot of people don't. They want to see, okay, how do I start? Let's get going. They don't think, well, let me play and try a few different ways.
Yes.
So
They want the cheat sheet rather
there
than
you go. Quickest path, as you said. Shortest path.
Yes. And I do understand that there are merits to using the shortest path. But
you don't want to give them a long-winded explanation either that scares them senseless. If
Or
you
bores
take
them to
or
sleep.
bores them to sleep, if you take something like your inequalities, for example, you could do it from first principles, and it is quite hectic to do it like that if you've got a quadratic inequality. But it also develops an understanding that should they ever be given an expression like A times B greater than 0, they understand what that means.
yes.
So what I would do is normally show them the once how to do it the long way and the understanding way and what they're actually doing. And then I would move them into using perhaps a better way, a more succinct way of doing it.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's really important. You're right. You can't always shortcut.
Yes. Okay. Yes, Dylan.
So moving perhaps onto the planning,
Yes.
is there a sense in which when you are starting to think about a plan that you can identify those sections of the curriculum, those parts of the year where it's going to be, where the circumstances will be amenable to allowing a little bit more freedom, a little bit more investigation, a little bit more time and space, and those parts of the curriculum where you make a decision, all right, for the sake of creating space elsewhere,
Yes.
I'm going to just do this the short and nasty way. And
I would agree with you.
Is that kind of just a hard balance to try and get right?
Look, it comes with experience. The more experience you have, you know where you can shortcut and where you can't. And where that understanding is vital to move on to other sections. Okay. So you are right. There are times where you can make that kind of decision. And just to sort of mention the CAPS document, they give you a guideline as they see sensible. But you as the teacher are the professional in the classroom. And yes, you do have to keep to the CAPS document, but you can tweak a lesson or two here and use it for a little bit more investigation in another section. As long as you're following, getting it done. That's the bottom line.
Okay.
I agree with you there, Dylan, definitely.
Okay. So, what is planning?
Well, there's lots of levels of planning, and the CAPS documents have been very, very kind to us in terms of the large picture planning. Basically, they've taken the curriculum, they've divided it into different grades for you. So if we go to page 17, you'll see there's in your CAPS FET document, you'll see that they give you like a grade 10, 11, and 12 summary of what should be done per term. Now, obviously, this has been done with an ideal situation. I think they worked on 11 weeks in term 1 and 2. I think there was slightly less in term 3 and term 4. I think it was 10 and 8.
10 and 8, yeah.
Around there. So they have sort of planned it there, and of course your terms will vary from year to year. Hopefully they're more or less that. But it gives you here's the plan for this child for the next 3 years. This is what I must get through. I know that some people are feeling quite restricted by this, and I understand that because some people like to teach certain things before they teach other things. And this has been decided by a group of professionals that worked on the document. So in their opinion, that's how they would teach it. Now, it depends, if you're in a private school, you can basically move it around. But I think as far as I understand within the government schools, you have to stick to the order of the CAPS document.
I do think that's important because I know with science they use trigonometry. And I had a couple of occasions over a number of years where they've done trigonometry first in science and then come to my grade 10 maths class, and I've had to unteach what the science teacher has told them. And so
That is
this,
so
I know with
often
this
the case.
ordering, the science teaches trigonometry afterwards. It's
So,
good.
yeah, of course, they only do it in term 2 in grade 10. So they probably would have met it in science already in term 1, I would imagine. Probably
no,
not.
with new caps.
Is it actually right now with science?
It is right with
I'm
science.
not a science person, so I wouldn't know. But that's obviously one of the thought pattern that went into planning this.
And it's wonderful.
So
It's
I think
well
it's
done
wise.
to those people.
Yeah, it's wise. I think these were very much good professional teachers who sat down and thought, right, let's think through a plan. I know with myself, if I'm teaching trig equations, I like to teach trig graphs before.
Yes.
Because for me, it makes more sense why you're getting the solutions and so many solutions if you've done your trig functions already.
I think it is done that way
Is
in
it done
grade
that way?
11.
Okay, let me have a quick look and just check that. Trig reduction formula graphs, equations.
Lump them all into a 4-week period.
Yeah, so you can actually then choose, I suppose, which
Yes,
is great.
Yeah,
That's
so
fine.
CAPS hasn't been prescriptive, I guess, in how to teach those things.
So in those 4 weeks, I would do my graphs first and then only go on to the actual solving. Because for me, it makes much more sense why you're working in other quadrants and why they're positive and negative in these various quadrants if you've done the functions.
Yes.
But I'm very much a person who likes to graph. Obviously, when I was learning maths, it was something that made sense to me. I know a lot of people don't like to graph, but it's just a little warning with you look at the weightings of functions in the syllabus. You had better become very enthusiastic about
Yes.
your graphs, otherwise you could be in some trouble.
Just on a side note there, if there is anyone who wants to look at how to teach trig equations from a functions point of view, we have done a couple of webinars in the past, so go and check out the blog and you'll find those, and then you can look at that. And it is exciting teaching it from the point of view from graphs. I must admit, when I was teaching, I didn't do that, and I'm sorry I didn't after those webinars.
Well, when I first started teaching, I also didn't do that. And then I had the privilege of working with a very good teacher somewhere along the line in my early days. And he always did it like that. And I thought, why didn't I think of it? It was such a logical thing to do.
It's a
and
light
ever
bulb
since then,
moment.
it is a light bulb moment. And ever since then, I've been using that because it just makes it so much more accessible to the child as to why things are happening. It's not this rule they're learning without any context. So I must admit, I'm quite sold on that. So, yeah.
Yes. Now, yes, Dylan, do you have a question?
Sorry.
No, it's good to ask questions.
I've got another one, and I'm not sure whether you're going to get to this, but just on that point, you were teaching something one way, you worked with another teacher who was doing it another way that you thought was better. Is the fact that planning often forces teachers together, not some of the benefit. It's obviously to have the plan is good,
Yes.
but as a kind of a side benefit, the fact that teachers are almost forced to talk to each other and share and debate, also part of the process.
I think it's so important. I think a lot of us lose, when we have conferences and courses, people don't go. And even me, who's been in the classroom for as long as I can remember, I always go to any conference or course I go to, because even if I learn one new thing or see one new idea, it's better than it was before. And so I would agree with you. I think you've got to be flexible enough to know when something, and obviously you'll listen to some people show you things and you'll think, no, that's not going to work, because you've got to go with your personality. So I had a friend who used to dance the trig curves. She used to stand on the chair and dance them. Yes, it's exactly what she was doing. And the kids loved it, but it wasn't me. I couldn't bring myself to stand on a chair and do that.
Show us, Helen. There we go.
And the children really loved it because it was funny and she looked priceless and the whole thing was just a big joke. She obviously hadn't have a shy bone in her body, and it was great. I admire her. I couldn't have done that. I would have felt highly embarrassed climbing on a chair and doing that. So I would send her next door to watch her dance them. But, things like that, it's always good. So I listened to her, and I could see the advantage that the children would see the humor in it and enjoy it and understand it. But I would never be brave enough to do that myself. So I think you've got to listen to what your colleagues say and decide whether that's something that relates to your personality type and you can teach like that. It's the same as discipline. Discipline is very much a personal thing. I know when I first started teaching, I had a headmaster who told me, you walk in the class, the first child you see that opens his mouth or her mouth, you take them out. You punish them, you make a big fuss, and from there on you have no trouble. I couldn't bring myself to do that. It just was not me. So I think it's the same with planning and with your lessons. You have to identify with that in order to make it successful.
Now, Dylan's question does link in very nicely with our next point, which is who should be planning?
Well, the good news is the CAPS has done a lot of it for us. They've certainly done the big picture planning.
Yes.
What they can't do for you is anticipate what your school's going to have go on in it. For example, gala days, sports days,
photo days.
Yeah, photo days, visitors coming to talk about drug abuse, whatever it might be. They cannot know that. So they've given you a plan, and they've also tried to help you by giving some revision weeks. I suspect the revision weeks are actually not revision weeks. I suspect they're used as run-ons, where you've had interruptions and you need to run on your scheme of work or syllabus as it stands. So in terms of planning, it also depends what size school you are. If you're a very large school, one of the schools I'm involved with is a huge school, and it's got like 14 maths teachers. So it's a very big school. And then the other one, the other high school, is a relatively small school and only has 4 maths teachers. So the one with 4 maths teachers, you can't really, you basically find that the 4 teachers end up teaching just about every level. Whereas in the big school with the 15-odd teachers, there you would have like 4 teaching grade 8s.
Yes.
And they would be the only ones involved in the grade 8s and grade 9s, etc. But what is very important is that the meetings they have together. So even though they might only be teaching your grade 8 and your grade 10 or your grade 8 and 9, they're in the meeting so they can hear where all these topics are going. So that they don't just leave it out thinking, oh, this isn't important. And it really is important for your grade 10 or your grade 11 or your grade 12. So when it's a big school, you can actually have someone in charge of a grade, which is what they do. They take one of the 4 teachers in that grade and they say to them, you are in charge of the grade 8s. And it's then their teacher's job to take this large planning, this year planning, and break it into the smaller bits, which I'll talk about in a moment.
Yes.
And to anticipate the disruptions and see where we need to do some emergency measures, which we'll also talk about, I'm sure, before we get done. And also to look at the planning for when the testing and that sort of thing will happen in the group. So the children can be informed timeously that they're writing a test on such and such a date, on these sections, and then they refine them as we get closer. So that person keeps an eye on it. But now when you're in the smaller school with only 4 or 5 teachers, it's much harder to have that sort of situation. So what I find that head of department does is she lets someone oversee the grade 8 and 9 planning and someone oversee the grade 10, 11 and 12. So she's divided into senior phase, FET phase. And then they've each got the planning there and it gets done. And then where it runs over, then you see them tweaking it or moving it. Like the grade 11 syllabus is extremely packed. And I know that we've had to call the children in for like extra sessions, basically, because they haven't been able to get through all their work, where we'll have a section and we'll teach it to them out of school time, and we'll offer it because there are 4 teachers. They can go to 4 different times, basically, so every child can make it in spite of their extramural or whatever else they're doing. And then that's how we do emergency measures on the big school. Small school, it's a little bit different.
Now, these grade, I'm going to call them grade coordinators, because that's what
name
we
for
refer to them as. I've been in 2 situations. The one where we have given a manageable outcome, and the other where we've given activities per lesson. Which would you say is better?
It depends on your experience of your teachers. If you've got very inexperienced teachers, maybe the activities per lesson is not a bad idea. But again, if you're defining too closely what must be done in the lesson, you don't allow your teacher some professional movement. So, they might prefer to do it a certain way versus what, someone else's worksheet is never really quite your worksheet.
Yes.
But that worksheet could be useful for other things. So sometimes someone would hand me, we used to have a system in the school I was in before I went into this post, where if anybody produced anything, we'd automatically run enough copies for every staff member to get one extra. And we'd pop it in everybody's pigeonhole, and it was your choice if you wanted to use it, and how you used it was up to you. So you might have decided to teach off it, although I find that quite difficult unless the teacher's got a similar style to me. Or you could use it as a revision tool and say, this is a nice exercise to do at home. So I think it depends on your staff and how experienced they are and how much guidance they need.
Yeah.
I know some of the first year teachers I've come across feel very empowered by the system where you get told, here is the stuff you're going to do today in class. But of course they have to have enough warning to go through it before they get it in the last minute.
Yes. I would actually argue the opposite. I would say as a first year teacher, you should be given a manageable outcome. And possibly a file full of worksheets for the whole year, and say, use it, don't use it, but by the end of this lesson they should be doing factorizing on level 3 type questions, and ta-da, go for it.
Yeah, no, as I say, I've experienced the opposite. There were 2 first-year teachers when I first came into this group of schools, and the one wanted that prescription, this is the work for today. The other one was like you describing. She wanted to make her own decisions. And, it was, in fact, I think the school lends itself more towards the one who makes their own decision than the one who's told what to do. And she found it very traumatic not being given absolute guidance as to what should be done. And so she didn't last long. She lasted a year, and she said, no, I'm sorry, I can't work in this sort of environment. I need a more structured environment. I need someone who's saying to me, today we are teaching this, go to page so-and-so in the textbook on this worksheet and do that. So it's really just a personal preference, really. And I think the head of department has to be aware that there are different kinds of people, and maybe to ask what they prefer.
Yes.
Are they okay if we just give you this little file of stuff and say, be on your way? Or do you need more guidance and more structure? Maybe an idea is to meet with a new teacher and talk through with them what they're planning to do for the week. And just see if they're able to organize and plan themselves. It does depend.
Yes. Surely a head of department's role is to have everyone's year plan and lesson plans and...
Look, the head of department will certainly use the CAPS one and personalize it for the particular school. But the individual planning is something else. You'll get young, inexperienced teachers going into class, planning to do a lesson. They've looked in the textbook. They haven't worked through the problems themselves. They come in, they give it to the children. Okay, work on exercise 2.1, number 1 to 5.
Yes.
And the next minute the child can't do it, comes to her, and of course they can't do it either because they haven't worked it through. So you've got to watch that kind of thing. As a new teacher, it's the most terrible feeling in the whole wide world to be sitting with this child looking at you and you can't do it. So my advice is the head of department of inexperienced teachers to tell them whatever they give the children, they have to have tried themselves. Yes. And if they're not sure, to come and see you or see another member of staff that's more experienced before they go into that classroom. Because once you're in there, and of course it doesn't help to wing it. Because
no, definitely not. Even as an experienced teacher.
I mean, there have been occasions where they've brought a question they found somewhere or another and stuck it up on the board. And I've said to them, look, this is what I would do, but let me think about it and see if there was a better way to do it. Because, maybe the way I went was a scenic route.
Yes.
And maybe there was especially geometry. Geometry is a bad one to just be thrown an example from, because there's so many ways you can get to the end.
Yes.
And so you might take them via, and it could be done in 2 steps. But there I always warn them, if they bring me a question out of a paper or something, to look at the mark allocation. because the mark allocation will tell you. If it's 2 marks, believe me, you're not going to be spending more than 3 lines on it. Most 3 lines. If it's 6 marks, well, plan on a little bit of activity. So I try and help them like that so that they know. And that's what I do when I look at a paper. I look at the marks and say, okay, this will take a bit of effort because it's quite a sort of meaty amount of marks.
Okay. Shall we take a look at page 17?
Definitely. 18 is now for your grade 10s.
Yes.
And it gives you like a breakdown now, nicely set out. And if you look at it, it's the first term, it runs your theory through there. And you notice at the bottom, the assessment, it's running at the bottom. It says investigation or project, and then test. I remember we talked about this last week, that maybe for 5-6 weeks around there, you should be testing properly. And I'm not talking about little tiny tests. I'm talking about substantial tests, properly set with the right levels, etc.
Okay.
And there's your term 2, and you can see there's your mid-year exam. And what's nice about the planning is they've allocated 3 weeks for mid-year exam. I think that's a realistic amount of time for a mid-year exam. If it's running more than that, I probably don't think the children are much at school then, because, if they're going to write, certainly in grade 10, they've got 8 subjects at most, with LO being one of them. I think that's more than ample time. And then the term 3, you can see it running there. It's also basically thing. And then finally in term 4, you will see that there's a revision slot. And that's quite a lot of revision there. They've given you 4 weeks of revision in grade 10. Quite honestly, I doubt that is going to happen, because you're going to find that some of the stuff, and we will talk a little bit later about how you're going to watch the textbook versus the CAPS document, because you could have run-ons like number patterns, for example. They've allocated 1 week to it. But you could spend a week and a half on that, even 2 weeks on it, if you're doing in-depth kind of number patterns. But if you're following the CAPS, it should be only that long.
Now, okay, number patterns in grade 10, they don't have to do any formulae. It's just intuitive recognition of a number pattern.
And they've been doing number patterns from when they were in intermediate phase.
Yes.
So it's not a completely strange thing for them at all. So a week is ample for what they have to do in grade 10. I suppose you could add in things like your squares and your cubes, and maybe you could throw in odd and even numbers, whatever, something like that, just to give them a little bit of a different taste. Maybe even exponents you could throw in there. You could give them a pattern with exponents. So you could enrich that situation, and it's a lovely section for those harder level questions.
Oh, yes, when you get to exam time and you need a level 4 question,
Beautiful
number
place to
patterns
go.
is where you're going to draw it from.
And as I say, the children have had a lot of exposure to patterning. I've got a sister-in-law who teaches grade R's, and she says that children that can't pattern will struggle with maths, and she's dead right. She says definitely when she watches them and she sees them struggling, of course patterning in grade R's where you're putting out a round thing, a square thing, and a triangle, and then you've got to keep repeating that pattern. So it's very basic. But she says if they can't do that, you can be pretty guaranteed they're going to struggle with mathematics.
Now, this investigation or project, what is
usually, and I'm sad to say, it's usually a worksheet, a glorified worksheet.
Okay.
Which is sad.
What should it be?
It could be so much more than that. If you look there, you're going on to trigonometry. So what you could have done in that investigation or project, you could have got them like a challenge and say to them, there's a building outside and I want to measure the height, but there's no way I can actually go and measure it physically. It's too tall. So what way can I come up with to find that out? So a child then could go, obviously you need to give them a little bit of guidance, like maybe set them up with a protractor, show them how they can take it and they can use it as to measure the angles, or maybe show them that if you're using a shadow of a tree, it can help you get the height of the tree. But that could be a great introduction to your trigonometry.
Okay.
By getting them to play with like similarity. This little triangle is similar to this one.
Yes.
The shadow mirrors the tree. Let's see if that'll help me get the height of the tree.
Yes.
But
it's an assessment activity, though.
That is the problem. So, of course, the moment it's an assessment then you've got to try and rein it in a little bit. But I think you should have that kind of element, even if not all of it is that. So maybe, I would guess, just looking at where it's positioned, all you've done is algebraic expressions and exponents and number patterns when you do that particular thing. So probably it would just be a whole lot of questions. But if you could tie it into a real situation, something a little bit more than the everyday in the classroom, it would be a fabulous thing to do. Of course, you don't want them to just go straight to Google and copy. You want them to think a little bit and use the opportunity. But yes, unfortunately, it sadly is more than likely just a homework assignment.
Now, with your planning, though, you're looking at those 3 sections, and you know you've got an investigation or a project coming up. Surely you would decide on the investigation or project and then, I'm going to kick myself for saying this, but teach towards it.
Yeah, you would. You're not really teaching towards it, but you're giving them the tools.
That's much better.
Yeah, you're not actually showing them, okay, this is what you do in the first question. You're saying to them, okay, here's a technique that could be useful. And so I just believe in building a toolbox of strategies for every child. And they don't have to use those strategies, but it's nice to have this little box of tricks, if you like. Not really tricks, it's strategies, where when they're looking at something completely foreign, they can say, okay, well, this has got exponents, and I remember the teacher mentioned that an approach would be this. Let me try it.
Okay, I've just had an idea based on your toolbox thing. What if we were to create a notebook on the side? We have our notebook where we make all of our usual notes and things like that. But our notebook on the side, we've got covered in red paper, and we've got big black letters across it saying toolbox. And we make our own little notes over there, only notes and maybe 1 or 2 examples of questions. But let's go back to difference of 2 squares. Difference of 2 squares is blah, 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 blah. And then when they need a tool, they can go into their toolbox, find it.
Correct. That's actually a very good idea. I mean, like you say, you're talking about difference of 2 squares. You could get them to have a look at the spatial version of that, where they've got 2 squares and they chop them up and they make them into A plus B and A minus B.
That's a good investigation.
It's a lovely investigation. It could go really nicely into their project.
Yes.
So, if you know, as you say, you've got these 3 sections, you can start thinking around it. So, all right, you wouldn't show them how to do A minus B, A plus B from A squared minus B squared, but you might show them A plus B all squared.
Yes.
And how you got A squared plus 2AB plus B squared using diagrams. So now they've got that tool and they've got a way of accessing it.
Yes.
It's the same as, if they've got computer access, you could use spreadsheeting as another way to access this kind of information. There was a nice portfolio piece I put together in a book I wrote where they had to solve a trig inequality actually, using 5 different approaches. So yes, they had 2 traditional that they'd been shown in the classroom, but then they had to think out the box for the other 3. I did give them hints, like I said, you could use your computer. Didn't tell them go and use your Excel spreadsheet. I told them to think about using different versions. I think I had it like tan greater than cos. I said, well, maybe you could make tan sine over cos, and get them to think about that. So things like that. So I gave them hints, but I didn't give them how to do it.
Okay.
And I'd given them, say, an algebraic version of a similar question where I took like x squared minus 1 and greater than 0, and then I said to them, okay, you could also make it x plus 1, x minus 1, and do 2 straight lines instead of a parabola. So I'd shown them a technique using algebra and then asked them on their own to go and do it with trigonometry.
Okay.
So that's just techniques you can use to push the packet.
Okay, so we are supplied with this pacing thing, and then at the bottom we have a little table in the bottom right.
And that is very useful because this tells you how you should be weighting your papers. Of course, June, it won't be so easy to do that because you wouldn't have covered all the work that you've got. But you could take the weighting that's given to these things at the end of the year because you'd only have done half the work.
Yes.
And you probably would only be doing 1 2-hour paper, not 2 2-hour papers like at the end of the year. But what is very important about this pacing thing is sometimes the marks allocated to the section don't match the time given to the section. So if you look, there they've got, I'm just trying to see if there's an easy one to show you.
Well, let's go to the grade 12 one.
Yeah, the grade 12 one would perhaps give us a better demonstration of it. So that's page 20.
Yes, page 20. And you're looking specifically at...
Yes, let's look at geometry there. That's a beautiful one to look at. You'll see it's in the 3rd term. It's the first 2 weeks of the term. But if you look at what paper 2 says, it says Euclidean geometry, and it gives you 50 marks for it. Now that's huge. So if you're thinking to yourself that all these papers together is 300 marks, that means 1/6 of the paper is geometry that you've only spent 2 weeks on. Yes, you did do geometry in grade 11 and you did do geometry in grade 10, but that would say to me that I need to be putting in all my little tests, geometry, and perhaps doing some worksheets and revision sheets and odd questions in the class where they realize, oh my gosh, I need to make this geometry really good. Because 50 marks is a sizable amount.
That's a large amount of marks for 2
scary.
weeks worth of work, and the last time they've done that would be grade 11.
That's right.
And let's face it, this group of grade 12s are our first group through the CAP system. So, and we're all teaching Euclidean geometry again for the first time in 7 years, 8 years, whatever it is.
I think it was about 2005 when it went out. I must admit that I'm glad it's back. I love geometry, Euclidean geometry in particular. But if you look at the division of that paper too, in the syllabus prior to this one, so the original, what the old higher grade, standard grade syllabus, they used to have 200 marks in a paper. They used to give 80 to geometry, 80 to trigonometry, 60 to geometry, and 60 to analytical. Now they've actually turned it around. They've made the Euclidean geometry the biggest portion of that paper.
It's a very interesting move.
It is, and I'm wondering if teachers are so aware of it. Because I must admit, I was talking to a colleague of mine, and she said, do you realize that the geometry is quite sizable? And in my mind, I sort of had the same sort of proportion as what had been previously. And when I looked at the document, I realized, oh dear, no, it's definitely the most important thing in paper 2. And so one cannot afford to not make sure that your students are well prepared for that.
Yes. Well, let's look at the emergency procedures you've got set out. They are on a slide.
Yes, they are.
There are a couple of slides on, Dylan. One more, I think. There we go. Emergency measures. And these are the kinds of things you would do for that kind of section.
If I was running into trouble, I would feel that 2 weeks was just not enough. What I would certainly do in grade 12 is I would get time to revise in that grade 11 geometry, because it's a much bigger section. The grade 12 one is only 2 weeks. I think the grade 11 one is a little longer. I'll just have a quick look. It's 3 weeks. So it's still very little. Over 2 years, you're doing 5 weeks of it. So a nice thing to do with that is to perhaps give them like a quick crash course, like a lecture, maybe one day after school. Say, okay, we're going to be revising. You can't use your teaching time until you're sure you've got it. So rather do this out of normal hours or breaks or before schools or whatever's convenient. But I would give them probably a sheet with a summary of all their all their theory that they've got. And
or they would have a toolbox.
Their toolbox would be a good one. They could just open it and there would be like theorem 1, theorem 2, theorem 3, so they'd know. And I would encourage them to know their geometry in picture form rather than words. Because I always say to them, when you're looking at a geometry rider, you're looking at a picture, you're not looking at words. Now you've learned the theorem says the angle at the center is twice the angle at the circumference. What's that? It's not going to help you at all. It's much better to have the picture of what that looks like in your mind. So my toolbox would have a whole lot of pictures with the reasons next to it. And then I would say to them, okay, fine. And then I would give them a problem and I'd say, okay, let's look and see which theorems in your toolbox will can you see in this picture? So I'd get them to have a look, and they'd see maybe the angle at the center. Maybe they'd see a tangent. Maybe they'd see an angle in a semicircle. And I'd say, okay, now those 3 theorems you can see in the picture. So probably they're going to help you in this actual problem.
Now maybe that, I know your second emergency measure is sections done using self-study. Maybe that would be a good self-study.
You know, it was a fabulous section for self-study, but it's out the syllabus now. It's linear programming.
Yes.
It was a perfect section to send them off. You had to just give them the bare bones of how you decide whether you shade above or below, what to do if the line's included or not included. And basically, they could self-study that very effectively. Yes, they could self-study their grade 11 again, but I still think I would give them at least a 15-minute recap on what they know. Plus, I would also help them because I suspect it's going to be a nightmare to mark the geometry, as usual. That was always the case before. And we've been told in the IB that if we don't get somewhere, they're not going to wade through it. So we must make sure that the children are structured and moving in the right direction. So looking at the picture and writing down everything you see is not going to do it.
Okay.
I can't speak for the government. I don't know what the examiners there have said. But certainly we've been told that if you have to prove A equal to B, and you're mentioning P and Q and R and S, and it's got nothing to do with A and B, you're not getting any marks, and we're not looking through it. So I would teach them some strategies. I'd say, right, if we're proving A equal to B, let's put A and B underneath each other, and let's find something else equal to A and something else equal to B.
Okay.
Just so they've got a structure. So I would revise with them, because that 50 marks can be quite traumatic otherwise.
So lectures with worksheets is what you would do as
basically,
the emergency
yes,
measure.
Yes.
Then sections done using self-study would be, you do a section and then later on you introduce some, here we go home and study it.
Yes, I would give them the bare bones of what they needed to do. I mean, maybe what would lend itself, I'm just looking here at the topics, maybe probability is something. If you gave them the bare bones of what probability is, how we work with it, what a relative frequency is versus the real probability, etc. But it might be risky because it's the first time
I think
it's been done.
risky.
So, I mean, that's also the thing. But statistics might be a good one, actually.
Yes, very definitely.
You've done statistics right the way through grade 8, 9, 10.
Yeah, and
so
that's just standard deviation and something else.
And, all right, you do least squares and those things, extras, but then I wouldn't do that as self-study. But I certainly would be able to cut that 3 weeks down, probably to 2 weeks quite effectively.
If it's
on stats,
needed.
if I needed to.
Yeah.
Hopefully not, but we never know. So that's. I think that's a section I would probably head to if I was going to.
Okay, now Leigh, flipping the classroom, please give us a
Yes.
definition of it.
Well, for me, what it means is that the children learn at home. They then come to school to do their exercises. So the teaching happens in their home or after school or wherever they are. Of course, you have to make sure that the children have availability to things like Khan Academy, anything, or Mindset, or whatever. They've got to be able to get hold of the work. So that would be an ideal thing. So say, for example, on Saturday morning, there's a grade 12 lecture. And you could look and see it's going to be on trigonometry or whatever it is. You could say to them, I want you all to watch that lecture on Mindset, Saturday mornings, 9 o'clock, whatever it is. And then on Monday, we're going to work on worksheets to do with that. And why I like that is the actual learning is happening under controlled circumstances. They're all doing the same thing. They're coming in and you've got a chance to help them when they get stuck. Because that is what they won't have watching the television.
Yes.
They won't have someone overlooking and seeing, okay, we're making a mistake here or there. You can do that as the teacher.
Surely you, as the teacher, could create your own video.
Very much so. If you have an iPad, you've got EduCreation on it, which is fabulous. You could also use the smart technologies.
Even if you've
tablets.
got a normal cell phone. A cell phone camera can record.
A cell phone camera is a really good thing. That's actually a very good idea because most people will have cell phones and mostly they do have smart ones because it seems to be the fashion, especially youngsters. They really like their phones. So yes, that would work very well. So you could then give a lesson, record it, and send it out to, say to the kids, right, I'm sending it out, or putting it on WhatsApp or whatever the case may be. Access it, watch it, and we will be doing exercises.
You can Bluetooth it across for those
great,
who...
yes.
Then there's no money needed from the students if they have the kind of technology that they could watch it.
That's the risk of the flipping the classroom. But there are ways you could get around it. You just have to be clever. I mean, you can use the televisions, as I say. That's one thing. They could get together with each other and sit and watch the program. Someone would have 319 and go and watch it.
Now, I'm going to interrupt you quickly, and before I come to you, Dylan, I want to make a point here, this irritates me slightly, because in my mind, flipping the classroom is basically self-study with videos. And people use this new terminology, and they think they're doing something big and magical. And yes, they are doing something big and magical.
They're doing something they were never doing
good.
before, perhaps.
But don't call it something new. It is what it is. It's self-study.
It's self-study, but with technological aids, if you like.
Yes.
Whereas before, self-study was like read the textbook, and I think that's a skill that our children have lost. I don't think they know how to read a textbook.
Well, that's where I come in. I actually wanted to challenge Helen's assertion. Well, maybe it's both. That what on earth is that noise?
Sounds like something landing on the roof.
I say something wrong.
You know, I have people in high places.
Okay, everything you said is perfectly correct. What I wanted to say, though, was this notion of the flipped classroom, as old as it might be, in my mind, isn't actually dependent on media. It is just this self-study. It could be a set of notes.
Yes,
it could be a chapter of the textbook. The interesting thing about self-study for me is, let me as a teacher become a little bit more productive by not doing something that learners can do for themselves, but stepping in where learners can't do stuff for themselves. And that's in, right, I've got these questions, I've studied the theory of this thing, I'm trying to apply the theory to these questions, and I'm getting stuck. And in a sense, that's where the real learning happens anyway.
That is true.
It's not when the teacher's up in the front of the class explaining difference of two squares. It's when the learner has to now take that knowledge and apply it in all the unique situations.
Well, that is so true.
And so maybe this notion of the flipped classroom is for everybody. It is something that anybody can do, because you can send your learners home with their textbook, assuming they've all got their textbooks.
Yeah, that's the next problem.
And say, I want you to read up on this section, and tomorrow we're going to do these, you're going to do these questions, but I'm going to be here to help you. Rather than sending them home to do the questions, well, there's nobody at home. The teacher's role is kind of being outsourced to
people who don't have qualifications.
To no one, really. My 2 cents worth.
Okay, I'd like to add to your 2 cents. If you are doing the flipped classroom, and I like the idea of the flipped classroom, I'm not putting it down because I think it gives power to the teacher as the expert in learning rather than just imparting knowledge. But if you are doing that, you are going to have students who aren't asking any questions. There should be a minimum number of questions a child asks in a lesson. And the motto should be on the board: if you haven't asked 5 questions, you don't know how little you know. They need to come to school with 5 questions, at least 5 questions. Otherwise, they haven't done the flipped classroom properly.
Look, I was thinking about the notes, and I think it's a skill we've all lost, really. Well, not all. Older ducks still can do it. But the younger people are not big into reading text.
Yes.
And so, yes, the textbook can be used as flipped. But what I would do probably, if I was going to use written text, I would write or type my own notes using stuff that I would like them to use, and perhaps an explanation alongside as I was developing. I was just thinking while you were talking that perhaps something like completing the square would be something that you could give them in a written form, and they could process it and work through it and make sure they understood the steps, and then come practice it at school. So, I just think you have to be careful, because I know, I mean, even teachers sometimes in the group I'm working with, I'll say to them, and so what did your textbook, because the textbooks we've got are really superb. They've got the pupil book inside, and then they've got teacher instruction all around them. And I say, have you read that? And they haven't.
Yeah.
And I'm amazed, because surely that's your first step. But that's like a thing that old ducks did. We used to read the book. And maybe it's a dying art. And maybe it's something it shouldn't die. Maybe we should be encouraging it.
Well, it's especially in most circumstances in South Africa where that's the premier resource in the classroom. That's the only resource in the classroom.
That's right.
We've got to be using it better than perhaps we are.
Yeah, I agree with you. I find that, sometimes we become very textbook bound as well, where we take the textbook as gospel as opposed to the CAPS document. And that's something I wanted to mention for the grade 12, but we'll get to that when we've finished with this point. So I think you're right, Dylan. I think it is something that they've all got access to. They can access their textbooks, but you'd have to spend some time with the children and show them how to use their textbook effectively.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
Because sometimes they're not that friendly. Even as a teacher, I'll pick it up and I'll think, gosh, what are they on about? And then I'll finally realize what they're on about.
Yes. The use of PowerPoint presentations or services like Prezi or Google Slides or Google Presentation, whatever it's called, those can also be used for this kind of thing, and then you can at least put it in your own words.
That's very good. I know a lot of teachers are using PowerPoints to teach at the school I'm at. Schools I'm at, plural. Just one warning with that. Maths is not static.
Yeah.
So when you start using PowerPoints and you're just flipping up a solution, the children have turned off long before you get there.
Yeah.
So I'm a little bit nervous. That's why I would use something like Educreation or Smart, or one of those, that you develop with the children. You'd have your basic question up there, but you'd be able to develop with them the rest of it, so that they're forced to think with you and not have a fat holiday watching you give them a nice little slideshow, and they'll go and consult it later and see what's going on.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Okay, the last point is detailed notes to speed up the teaching.
Yeah, that is basically like something like I was mentioning, the completing the square one would be one like that, where I would have it all written up, because basically completing the square is a recipe. And so I would have that written up. I would save them copying it down, which would make it go a little bit faster. And I would have the skeleton of the lesson there, so that they just fill in on the sheets and it goes a bit quicker. But of course that costs money, because you've got to run off copies for all the children. Those are all factors you've got to take into account. Anything like that is always either time or money intensive, one of the two, so you have to weigh that up.
Okay. We are out of time, but I do want to talk very quickly about...
So enjoy being with me. I could talk too much.
I do want to talk very quickly about the textbook observation you made. Yeah. So why don't you talk us through it?
I'll talk very quickly on it and get to it. The CAPS document that I'm referring to is at page 41.
Page 41, which Dylan will find for us.
Yes,
now.
And basically it's a section that I know is problematic. When it first changed, I know the teachers would teach copious amounts of logs, and it was not being asked anymore. If you look at the actual document, it says, the 4 log laws will be applied only in the context of a problem related to finance, growth, and decay. And they give you the 4 laws. So they very distinctly say, we're not going to give you these 4 laws unless they're being used in the context of growth and finance. And then they basically talk about, that I think they mentioned somewhere here, manipulation involving the log laws will not be examined. They clearly say that there for you. Then they give you an example of what could be examined, and they also show you alongside whether it's routine, complex, what it is. So that's quite nice things, but don't think that's all they can do. They could also ask a problem solving. I know there was these ones with earthquakes and or radioactive stuff, and how long is it before it's nothing, and that was the kind of application you can apply. So they're very specific. So I went to a very reputable textbook, which will remain nameless, And I had a look what they do on the section. They've allocated 1 week for you to do the section. So when I looked at this...
1 week in the CAPS document.
In the CAPS document.
Okay.
I had a look at this textbook. They start with revision of exponent laws and solving equations with 7 questions, which is maybe doable because, 7 questions, not that hectic. They could do it for homework. It's not a big deal. Then they do exponential functions, which they have done already. No, I don't know if they haven't really done it. 30 questions there. And yes, you do have to be able to draw your exponential graph. But if you did a merge of your exponential and your log functions simultaneously, you would achieve it far quicker than doing 30 questions just on exponential. Then when they get to the log functions, they deal with changing an exponent to a log and vice versa. 20 questions, and yes, you have to be able to do that. Solving for an unknown using the methods, and I've got there maybe, because in actual fact, once you can change, you can solve. But, it's something that's possible. And then they give you log laws, 33 questions. And no, it's not even in the syllabus. It clearly says they will only be used within the context of growth and decay. So in other words, only when we're solving for the n in annuity or whatever.
Yes.
So now you're doing all this manipulation for no good reason. And then the next thing they do is they use logs to solve exponential equations. And yes, there are 30 questions of those. And that is examinable. I've got an E next to it. And then graph of log functions, 33 questions. And again, I said to you, we could have done them simultaneously. So as an experienced teacher, if I look at this textbook, I would think it would probably take me about 2 weeks to teach that textbook content. But they've only allocated 1 week. Now, I know what's happened. The people who've written the textbook, being good mathematicians, are horrified at the thought of us just using the law without explaining where it's coming from, without making sure it's in place. And so they've catered for that. But we've got to be careful as the teacher not to fall into the trap of doing what the textbook says versus what the CAP says. Because the next thing, here comes your exam paper. There's 1 question on it, and it's to find the period on your annuity. And you've wasted 2 weeks teaching this log stuff that they're not going to get.
Missed out on Euclidean geometry.
Correct, which was counting 50 marks.
Yes.
So just to be aware of it and to be very aware of your CAPS document. I don't think we've got into good habits about reading our documents. And I think CAPS has gone to a lot of trouble to make this document very accessible to us.
It's about making the most important thing all the time.
Look, I do agree that the OBE one was very inaccessible because it was just these vague statements with no explanation about what you're doing. This is the exact opposite. So, excuse me, I decided to sneeze. Pardon.
Okay. I think with that, we are done. Dylan, do you have any more comments?
No.
I feel like we've been a bit all over the place with this planning show. That we've spoken about the CAPS document as a macro, looking at all of the terms. And then we've spoken about now looking at your textbook and evaluating which questions you should use and which ones you shouldn't. We've spoken about roles.
Yeah, just one thing I didn't mention, and that was something that was said to me by a superintendent of education once. He told me that your planning is determined by your experience. Less experienced teachers will unpack and do all the problems. He said, for someone like me who'd been in the classroom for donkey's years, it might be a matter of sitting down and thinking, tomorrow I've got this class. They're weak and I need to work on the following. I need to do these kind of questions. So it's more like an informal planning, whereas this class is very able and I need to extend them, so I need to have a little bit more. So more like that kind of planning versus the more rigorous planning that would happen with less experience.
Yes.
So, he just said, he gave me that advice and I thought it was very good advice.
Yes, Dylan.
Sorry, there is one thing that we haven't touched on, but maybe you can mention it in the blog. And that was the thing that Leigh, you mentioned, I think even before we started, the importance of viewing your plans never as final.
Yes.
That every year you go through, it's vital to look back at the year past, the term past, the week past, yesterday, and evaluate, well, did I plan correctly? How can I change my plans? How must I improve my planning so that every year you are gaining that experience in tangible and explicit ways. And you're not just expecting that next year you'll somehow have a vague memory of it not working last year.
A year later. No, you're definitely right. I mean, these documents are nice. So you could even write little notes on the side on your planning document and say, this I realized I needed to do this. Perhaps I could have left this exercise out. And your textbooks, your own textbook, write notes in it in pencil if you don't want to write it. I hate writing in a book, so I always write in pencil in it. Maybe it's good old grounding from donkey's years back. But you can actually write yourself notes and say, this exercise, these questions would have been enough to do. So then the next year, and you usually find the first year you do a new scheme of work, new curriculum, it takes you much longer than the second year, because now you've realized where you can perhaps cut down and where you need to add.
Yeah.
So you're right, Dylan, we need to do that all the time. We need to be aware of that.
Constant reflection.
There we go.
That's a very nice way of putting it.
Okay. I think it's time to say goodbye.
Okay.
Yes.
Pity.
It is a pity.
No, I definitely talked too much because this happened last week as well, so I do apologize.
I do feel like we need at least another hour.
And these are big topics, they especially planning and assessment. They are big ones. You can never stop talking about them.
Please send us your thoughts. And you know what I'd really like people to start doing, and I was talking to Dylan about this earlier, is to start sending us videos of their thoughts. So you don't just have to type it. You can talk to the camera or video yourself teaching or video your plans or something. Put it on YouTube, send it to us, and let's make a collection of people's thoughts and ideas about education.
And when they've got some good ideas, they should also go to these conferences and share them with their colleagues.
Yes.
I think it's such a good thing. Their MISA conferences run now in July, and I think there's one that I've just heard about today in Attridgeville, I think August-ish. So come and share your ideas and volunteer to speak and to share your ideas.
Yes, no one is an expert, but everyone has their strengths. So talk about your strengths. With that, thank you, Dylan, for the magic, and thank you, Leigh, for your input.
Nice being with you.
Yes. And we'll see you again next week. Goodbye.